you muted there.
Michael Gore,
Here.
Robert Romer,
Here.
Austin Groner,
Here.
Michael Lau,
Here.
James Barr,
Here.
and Eric Nyland is not in attendance yet.
Okay, the only agenda item we have tonight is a meeting with Randall Arendt. Am I pronouncing that right? Arendt?
Arendt.
Arendt. To discuss land use planning grant. So, Randall, thank you for joining us, and I'll let you kind of go ahead.
Okay, great. Do you have my video on the screen, or is it just a voice?
We have your video. Yep.
Okay, good, because I don't see myself on the screen. I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a disembodied voice coming across the cyberspace. Okay, well, thanks for all joining us tonight. This is an opportunity for us to discuss the memo that I sent out last fall. And Pamela sent me some comments last Friday. I've looked them over. I sent her back an email with a few short case studies that kind of focused in on some of the points that I thought were, particularly important. That is, is there a choice between individual septic systems on house lots or individual septic systems in the common open space or shared septic systems in the open space? And the same thing could be for the water supply. Wells on the lot, individual wells in the open space or shared wells in the open space. So I sent a few case studies, a couple of my favorites, one from Ipswich, where they had a shared community septic system in the open space. That was Partridgeberry Place. I think that was town water, so wells were not an issue. And the other one was from coastal Connecticut, Madison, Connecticut, Strathmore Farms, that had individual septic systems, not a group system, but individual septic systems in the common open space. And developers generally prefer that, so they don't have to build some super big, expensive utility up front. Sometimes homeowners prefer that, to have their own septic system, so they're not tied in with shared systems that they fear might be messed up by some of the neighbors pouring engine oil or some other inappropriate substance down the drains. So there are pros and cons. And in my experience with 2-acre zoning, you could avoid all those issues by having 1-acre lots in a 2-acre zone. Gives you 50% open space, and on a 1-acre lot, there's room for a well and a septic, particularly when the lots are laid out to encompass the best soils in the property. The justification for 2-acre zoning, or even 3 or 5-acre zoning I've seen in some other towns, is that, our soils are poor and we need a lot of land around every house for a well and a septic. And that's not true at all. What you need is an adequate amount of good land, of appropriate land, with enough well-drained soil above seasonal high water table or bedrock. You don't have to have an acre of good soil. You need maybe 5,000 feet of good soil. So obviously you can condense a 2-acre lot down to a 1-acre lot. And if the 1-acre lot encompasses good soil, you don't even have to think about a shared system like Partridgeberry Place or individual systems in the common open space as in Strathmore Farms. But if you'd like to do a cottage development, and I believe Michael mentioned in his comments that was not well received by the town, I'd have to see the proposal to understand why it wasn't well received, and maybe you can fill me in. But my experience is that a compact development of small lots, if it's within an overall framework of preserved woodlands or meadows or farmland, like Donovan Farm. That was the third case study I sent to Pamela to share around. Donovan Farm is also in eastern Massachusetts, as is Partridgebury Place. And that was laid out with a very compact kind of hamlet. Not only did it include a lot of preserved open space on the property, because it was really a conservation project as much as a development project, but in addition to it having a lot of conservation land around the village, there was open space within the village, and that makes a lot of difference the way that people look at village housing. If village housing is compact and just jammed together around some parking lot, people are going to say, what the heck? That doesn't look like what we want Bolton to be like in the future. But it was nicely designed around a village green and surrounded by other open space that you would have within a conservation design framework. I think that the cottage concept could be dusted off, revisited, revamped, and maybe presented back to the town at public meetings. And
Could I just add something to that? Actually,
Sure.
yeah, so that I wasn't here for the initial intros, but I was around when that was presented. And I think our concept is basically what you're saying, but I think it was more a matter of us not marketing enough. And like I think one person got in front of the town meeting and said, well, what about water usage? And everybody else said, yeah, what about water usage? And then that, that was kind of the end of it.
So we
But I think
did
if we
market that. I mean, we did, Eric. We had lots of
we didn't
meetings
have
with.
like we didn't have forums and stuff. I
We
don't
did.
not really.
Yeah.
Not like they're doing with the master steering planning committee. I don't think we marketed it enough.
Yeah. But
Like
we
we didn't
didn't
have
have
any
answer to the
we,
water.
we didn't
issue.
have
I
any
mean,
concept drawings and stuff like that. People just kind of probably envision something more like closer to this, a really compact, and like then then they use the whole water usage thing as like but I don't think we really like pushed it ahead of time. Like if we had drawings and put it in the paper and spread the word and why diversity in housing is good, because we had 50% land for conservation.
Well, the graphics are really important because
Yeah.
people were trying to visualize something, and they thought, well, what's a compact development look like, and they imagine houses just jammed together. Cottages could mean like little low income houses that were tiny and out of character with the town. I do think that photographs taken from a ground level, aerial photographs, perspective drawings, all those are really important. What I wouldn't put out is a site plan because that's a two-dimensional abstraction, and probably 60% of the public would look at a drawing done by, say, an engineer that lays out these little squares here, and that doesn't mean anything to them. They need to see the three-dimensional, which is why a photograph of an existing example is really good. And
that's what we needed to
give
do
you
was to have a similar development, sort of like the case studies you sent to us. Is if we had done that, I think it would have gone over a little bit better. But people still were concerned about the water, and again, we didn't have a great answer for them.
Yeah, they're talking about the water supply rather than water, stormwater.
Yeah. So someone who, if someone who abutted a 10-acre parcel that bylaw could have, potentially affected, they would say, oh, well, I don't want all these, I don't want 20 houses going in there and all drawing up all the water and having my well run dry from it.
Well, is this an increase in density substantially?
Yes. Like, Eric, what was it, like 4x density, maybe?
Yeah. We were looking at yeah, we had different density bonuses. Like I think if I think we have to go back and look at the bylaw, but I think if you are over 50% set aside for conservation, then you could do 4x. And we said you can do like a mix of like attached or detached, however, like kind of leaving it kind of open to the developer, thinking kind of like townhouse style type units. But yeah, we set up to 4x, I think.
Meaning that 4 dwellings to the acre.
Yes.
So a 10-acre parcel could, if they had 10 good acres, not wet, not flood prone, they could
Yeah.
have maybe 35 or 40 units,
Yeah.
10 acres.
If they save 50% as open space.
Okay, so then they go from 10,000 square lots to 5,000, and that's fine. And 5,000 square feet of land per dwelling works really well with attached, and it can work well with detached. It would be a lot that's say 50 feet wide and 100 feet deep. That's 5,000 square feet. So clearly you can build a nice cottage on a 50-foot lot. It would necessarily have to have community water and community sewer. And that's only a technical aspect. If the engineers can make that work, there shouldn't be a problem. But I do understand the concern by a neighbor saying, well, now you're putting 40 houses, say 30, 35 houses on 40 acres. And I'm downsizing that from 40 because we have to have land for the utilities and land for the stormwater management area and land for the streets. So you at 40 the acre, you might need 50 acres for 40 houses, or if you only had 40 acres, you'd only get 30 houses. But one thing that I learned when I worked for a land trust in Pennsylvania was that when you draw water from the water table for a community well, if you put it into a public sewer, or if you process that water and discharge it into a river or a stream, then there's a concern with the net deficit of water. But if you put the water into leaching fields, then that water just goes right back into your water table. It's a recircle, it's a cycle. Everyone is drinking, wastewater. Everyone is. I mean, the amount of water on the planet hasn't changed since the planet was created or it came into being. A friend of mine in
It does
Pennsylvania
take time for that, right, Randall? I mean, it's not necessarily, you draw up the water, and yes, if you put it into a leach field, it is returning back into the earth. But I mean, depending on where the water table is, that could take years, decades. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, this again, Eric and I were ill-equipped to answer a lot of those questions.
Very ill-equipped.
Engineers could probably address that in a more technical way than I've just done, but it is true that if you put, 500 gallons of wastewater back into the ground and draw out 5 gallons of water a day, it's all going to come out. There's going to be a balance there. There won't be an imbalance. The imbalance is when you toss the wastewater into a public sewer or toss it into the nearby creek, and it just goes away.
Which we have none of that here in Bolton. There's no town sewer, no town water. So, but Randall, we kind of jumped in here. Like maybe we can step back for a second and or Bob, I don't know if you want to give kind of an overview of sort of what we're trying to accomplish with the purpose of this grant. I know, Randall, you've gone through all our bylaws and the subdivision rules and regs, but maybe kind of just speak broadly about what it is that you're trying to help us accomplish.
Well, let me talk for a minute. I mean, this all came out of a presentation and workshop that I attended in Harvard, 4 years ago. And what impressed me was that instead of looking at it from a flat engineering layout perspective, perhaps subtracting wetlands, but that was about it. It was a matter of stepping back, taking a look at what the environmental advantages and limitations were to a particular piece of land, and then start thinking through what is the best way to locate residences of different types, maybe multiple, small, large, what have you, in a way that preserves the open space and the environment and does it in a way that is reasonably consistent with the character, and I think it's hard to characterize character, but with the character of the town. And that's what impressed me. And it's sort of an upside down or reverse way of looking at subdivision development. And that's where, the traditional summary of it as the 4-step process comes in. Randall, you want to talk a little bit about, at a high level about that process and the philosophical approach to doing it? And what,
Sure.
and incidentally, one thing that I have taken exception to for a long time is having engineers come in and subdivide land using a computerized approach that takes into consideration an algorithm for our bylaws and then kind of lays it out automatically. And we've seen what results from that, as opposed to a land planner stepping back and taking a look at it and saying, what do you want out of this? And let's figure out a more appropriate approach to locating the residences, taking into consideration the environment. And by that, I mean, it's water and sewer as well as anything else. And then figuring out where your residences should go, where your wells ought to go, where your septic system ought to go. But Randall's much more articulate and knowledgeable about that than I am.
Okay, well, this will be something that I think we'll probably have a workshop presentation in the spring, like we had at Harvard when you came there about 4 years ago, just before the pandemic. The 4-step design process, as Bob said, basically turns things around so that you begin with the land and what you want to preserve. And you determine that in 2 ways. One, there's a very detailed existing resources and site analysis map. It lays everything out. It's lays out everything that is described in the subdivision control regulations, from the topo to the trees of various sizes to locations of meadows, the stone walls, historical artifacts, and more mundane things like where the utility lines are, overhead power lines, underground gas lines, and what have you. And you look at everything on that map as you walk the property, so you don't forfeit the 3-dimensional experience of learning what that land is really like. You don't forfeit it to the engineering firm. And matter of fact, I've been told by a number of engineers that they don't even walk the land. They have minions that do that. But the people with the engineering degrees prefer to sit in heated or air-conditioned offices and look at computer screens. And they feel that they can look at a computer screen and lay out a subdivision, and they really can't do a good job of it without boots on the ground, without really experiencing the property firsthand. That's why I put a huge amount of emphasis on planning board members walking the land. You might have an evening meeting in the summertime, late afternoon meeting, perhaps maybe a weekend meeting. we did this in the town of York 45 years ago, and I didn't invent it. I was a young planner then, and I was introduced to this. And I saw senior citizen members of the planning board, as well as ones that are half that age, walking the land, crossing stone walls, experiencing the land and taking the full measure with their eyes, and then have the opportunity to converse about what they're seeing with each other. And they're holding this existing resources site analysis map in their hand that points out, well, here's a stone wall, here's a cellar hole, here's a tree that's more than 8 inches in diameter, or more than 10 inches, or more than 12, or more than 18, depending on species. Trees fall into different categories for preservation, because if you say 18 inches, as your code does, you're probably not going to get anything there except the occasional oak that's 100 years old, or a big old white pine. But there are many trees that become important way before they reach 18 inches in diameter. So I think that's like a red herring. I'd take that 18 inches out of there and I'd put in, and I have model regs, what diameter different trees, like a dogwood. We probably don't have dogwoods in Bolton, but a lot of communities I work in, they're naturally occurring, or eastern redbud, and you want to flag them as soon as they get to be 5 or 6 inches. But I digress. So after the site walk, the 4-step design process comes into play. When I do a site walk with the planning board, I just walk back to the town offices. It's still a public meeting, and begin to sketch out what the conservation areas as step 1. If you have a conservation subdivision, an open space subdivision, the most important thing about that is the open space. So you don't leave that to the second or third or fourth step. You say, what do we want to preserve in addition to what you can't develop anyway? In addition to wetlands, floodplains, and steep slopes that are unbuildable, I like to aim for 50% of the rest. And overall, where that kind of approach has been applied in Pennsylvania for the last 25 years, 62% of the land is preserved. 12% of it is unbuildable, and 50% of it is half of the buildable land. So I begin by looking at the open space first, and a developer might say, well, that's kind of strange, if not, perverse, because I'm a developer. And I say, have you ever heard of a golf course development? And they say, sure, they make a lot of money. They've gone out of favor because golf is declining, but for 4 decades, they were making massive amounts of money for developers. I said, okay, have you ever seen a golf course development where you think the golf course was an afterthought, where they had the development designed and they said, oh, let's see if we can put 18 holes around here in the various bits and pieces of open space we have left? And say, of course not. You get a landscape architect in to design the golf course, and then you have the engineer design the streets and the house lot lines that go around it. Well, that's exactly what I would propose for Bolton. It's what I helped Westford adopt about 20 years ago. So instead of the landscape architect designing a golf course, the landscape architect in Bolton, as in Westford, would be the sort of head designer in step 1, which is the open space designation. The engineer is on the team the whole time, but he's not in the primary position for step 1. Step 2 is where the houses go. And that can either be the engineer or the landscape architect to position the houses so that every house either abuts the open space with their lot lines, or they look across the street to it, or they're just a 3-minute walk from the open space. So this is where the developer gets the economic advantage of the open space. It adds value to his 1-acre lot to have 10, 15, 20 acres of preserved open space in the development. The third step is where the engineer comes in, a full-fledged member of the team, and does the streets and the drains and the lot lines, if in fact there are any lot lines. There usually are, but in a condo development there wouldn't be. So what this does is elevate the landscape architect or physical planner to the step 1 and step 2 of this 4-step process. And the engineer whose training is at streets and drains and grading, he comes in, he or she comes in, and step 3 and step 4, where the landscape architect or planner is still on the team, but they've stepped back and they're just a supporting member of the team. So the 4-step process is really fundamental to how a good open space conservation subdivision is designed. I got it from a book. It's not original to me, but I got it from a book written by a landscape architect professor about 50 years ago. And it was called Anatomy of a Park. And what he did is he showed how a park would be created. He first laid out the areas to be preserved in the park. Then he located the campsites, step 2. Then he located the streets and the trails, step 3. And of course, there were no lot lines. But it gave me the idea, hey, why can't we design a subdivision as if it is a park? Bingo. And then the analogy with golf course developments came to me when I was engaged with developers, trying to show them that they're not giving up land, they're not giving up value, because if they're not familiar with an open space subdivision, they'll be suspicious that they're going to lose land and they're going to have to sell the house lots for less because they're smaller. And really that's totally untrue. So I think in a large nutshell, Bob, maybe not a peanut shell, but maybe like a Brazil nut or a walnut nutshell, that's the essence of a conservation subdivision procedure.
One point though, in step 3 and 4, you talk about the engineer getting involved, and to some degree, the engineer and the landscape architect have to take into consideration those elements of soil and so forth that are appropriate for septic systems, wells, what have you, so that there is some give and take, step 3 and 4 with steps 2 anyway.
Exactly right. And to the extent that we're on septics, as you are in Bolton, it's really important that the house lots be located on the best soils. Soils run the whole gamut. It's like a marble cake. You've seen a soil map published by USDA. So understanding the soils is really important from the very beginning, so that you know where the landscape architect and the engineer know where to locate the house lots that are going to have on-lot septics. If
Right.
you're not having on-lot septics, you can locate the house lots on mediocre soils and have the off-lot septics in a meadow that has the deepest drain, driest, most appropriate soils.
Yeah, and it's interesting that as a result of having to use good soil, in a number of cases in the last 30 years in Bolton, lots have been, pardon the expression, gerrymandered, so that the lot has a house and then a narrow section within the limits of our bylaws, and then ends up with a septic system a long way away from the house, generally, hopefully downhill from it. But there's a lot of that going on as well. And were they to have considered that in the beginning, I think it would have been a much, much better design, but that's past.
I saw that gerrymandering in Ipswich. A developer hired an engineer that did exactly that. He gerrymandered it, and he wasn't getting anywhere for 18 months with the town. Town didn't like it, the neighbors hated it, and the town planner had a quiet word with the developer. He said, here's a list of 3 landscape architects. Keep your engineer, but call one of these 3 guys. It was an alphabetized list. He called me first. My last name begins with letter A. And I said, Jim, the first thing we need to do is bring the abutters on the site and bring your existing gerrymandered plan. And he said, okay. And I said, don't forget to bring a pack of matches. And he said, I think I know where you're going. You want me to burn the plan in front of the abutters? I said, yes, because I want everyone to understand we're starting anew. And we involved the abutters with the site walk and the planning board members with the site walk. And when we went to the first planning board meeting with a concept plan, one of the abutters came up and said, I speak for all the neighbors. We hope you will approve this. The look on the developer's face was incredible. He just couldn't believe that his enemies had suddenly become his supporters. Gerrymandering is what often happens with our funny soils here in New England when you try to impose a conventional development plan, which is why I suggest, and this is part of my recommendation for Bolton, that you move away from that, that you in fact favor the conservation design and disfavor the conventional. And you can disfavor the conventional by saying you only get full density, 1 house per 2 acres, if you do an open space design. If you don't want to do the open space design, you're going to get 3-acre lots or 4-acre lots. You're going to lose density. And that's fair and it's legal. So you can do that to steer developers away from this practice of dividing land into lots with no protected open space, which flies in the face of your own comprehensive plan policies, which are to preserve open space and preserve rural character, preserve forest habitat, preserve farmland, preserve scenic views. Conventional development really is the adversary of the goals of your comprehensive plan. So I do hope that we can move in that direction.
So Randall,
Mike, can I say one thing on that
go
front?
ahead, Eric.
So say you have 20 acres of land. It's not simply, you get 10 houses, because it's what, most of our lots are a lot of wetlands and stuff. So maybe you can only actually build 7 houses,
Right.
And so then we would say, okay, well, now you can fit 7 houses using the phosphid in 1-acre lots. So if we don't do that conventional plan, I think it's not a straight calculation of 20 acres, 10 houses. It's kind of what you can conventionally build, and then we can move it down. And since I've been on the planning board, we always use phosphid. So I don't know how we would come up with that number besides doing a kind of a rough outline, at least, of the conventional plan. And along those lines, I had another question for you. So on the open space, what ends up happening is, there is so much unbuildable land on these lots, and there's only a little like upland, I guess you would call it, that most of the open space kind of becomes just the wetlands. So like, where do you stand on that? Like, usable open space versus wetlands, and same thing, like the wetlands and the lots, like I just said, getting the number on the conventional development, and then going down to phosphid.
There are 2 ways to approach that. I prefer the yield plan, but some people and some towns like the numeric approach. The yield plan is basically a conventional plan. It can be gerrymandered. He's going to show the maximum number of homes he can get, but it has to pass the straight face test. He just can't draw lines on paper. He's got to be able to show you that those lots are buildable. Now, the way I recommend that is that a 10% sample be required to have a deep hole test pit. And the 10%, the lots that would get the deep hole are going to be selected by the town. If you have a town engineer, do you have a town engineer?
No, we have a DPW head.
Yeah, well, your town engineer or consulting engineer looks at the yield plan, walks the property, looks at the soils map, and says, well, I don't really think that lot 6 is going to pass muster, and probably not 5 either. But do a test pit on lot 6, and if the worst lot passes, we'll give you the 7. We'll agree that 7 is the number if the most dubious house lot actually passes the perk test. So that's one way of getting to a yield plan. And if the developer first test pit fails, he's down to 6, and then he's got to do another one on the next worst developed lot. So that might be lot 5. And the planning board says, well, lot 6 failed. You're down from 7 to 6 lots. You're going to do a test pit on lot 5. If the test pit on lot 5 fails, he's down to, he loses another lot. So it becomes an exercise in losing house lots and losing time. So smart developers don't come in with an airy-fairy plan of 7 lots when they know in their heart that they can probably only get 5 or 6. But a yield plan is the way to put these lots to the test. The second part of the question was, well, what happens if most of the open space turns out to be wetlands? Well, if the lot is naturally mostly wet, the parcel is mostly wet, your open space is going to be mostly wet. But I try to put in my zoning bylaws the requirement that 50% of the buildable land on that property, on the 20 acres, if the 20 acres consists of 10 acres of wetland and 10 acres of good land, I suggest that 5 acres of the buildable land be set aside as open space, and that the house lots that would normally be 2 acres in size be 1 acre in size on the remaining land, which is that perks and that is high and dry.
So for that, you're basically you're reducing the size of the house lot.
Yes.
And I think that's a very, very critical issue that, I think the yield issue in the broad sense of maximizing the number of residences that can be put on, understanding the environmental limits and the open space is very critical. And in Bolton right now, one of the things we're seeing is even with some pretty large new residences, people are not thrilled with the idea of having a lot of their own land. They would be quite happy to have open space, have their houses relatively close to each other, and not have to worry about maintaining their land.
Yeah, there's a big trend toward that. I've noticed in the last 20 years, in fact. People want bigger houses, but they don't necessarily want bigger lots because
Right.
it's a lot to maintain.
But they do like to have open space nearby.
Yes, the trails.
Well, and to Eric's point,
And
I
habitat.
can't think of a subdivision that we permitted at least since I've been on the board, that hasn't been a phosphorus. And so, again, I'm not 100% like, I'm trying to figure out what we want to accomplish tonight in this meeting. If it's just to kind of give an overview and talk a little bit about the document, it might be a good time to, we have some new members on the board, to even step back and talk about what the phosphorus is. So we have, I'm probably not the right person to speak to this, but I'll say what, what I think it is, and then Bob or Randall or Eric, you can correct me. So, when a developer wants to build a subdivision and they have certain restrictions on how the lots can be laid out in that. And so Bolton has something called a FOSBRD, which farmland, open space,
Land residential
residential development, right? Which, while it doesn't give a developer any more density, meaning they can't build more houses on the subdivision, it gives them more flexibility in how they can lay out the lots. Is that a fair statement?
It is, and often it can shorten the length of roads.
And it can reduce the lot size, right? From in Bolton, it can go from 2 acres to 1 acre. Is that?
Yep, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. And so, in your document, Randall, a lot of the stuff talked about, FOSBRD by right, and kind of as Eric mentioned, we use the conventional subdivision to get the number of houses. And so without doing that bit of it, I'm not sure how they get it. But maybe that's something we revisit too, because I mean, in general, I'm more for more dense housing. I mean, I was a big proponent of the cottage overlay. I thought having smaller, more dense houses is the way to go. People seem to say that that's what they want out of housing. And so, we're trying to find a way to do it. So I guess, Randall, is one of the goals of this whole exercise is to amend our own FOSBRD process to either get more density or conserve more space. Like, what's sort of the big thing we're trying to get out of this, I guess?
Well, as Bob began, I think we really need to change that procedure of have a design process that's in the bylaw that says the first thing you do is you outline the open space. Second thing, you locate the houses, then streets and trails and lot lines. You have a landscape architect or a physical planner be a member of the team, senior member for the first 2 steps, junior member for the second 2 steps. Have the site visit with a highly detailed, informative existing resource site analysis map. You get to your density number, your lot count, through a yield plan, which is a mini conventional drawing. So the developer draws his standard gerrymandered development plan. You test it. You don't just say, well, okay, I agree that you get 8 lots or 7 lots on your 20 acres. You say, we're going to look at this and we're going to test the most dubious lots. You're going to bring in deep hole test pits and prove that they're actually buildable lots. Then you have the assurance that developers not using this as a Trojan horse to get, an extra lot that you could never get with a conventional.
Sorry, Randall, I don't mean to interrupt, but so that's kind of all the, like, once you have your, that's sort of the process by which it's done. I guess I'm asking more, is there stuff in our FOSBRD, whether it's changing the density of housing, like, would you recommend, would it be possible for us to go below 1 acre for house lots? I mean, are those the sorts of things that you're
yes, the examples that I sent, every single one of them, the Donovan Farm, the Strathmore Farms in Madison, Connecticut, Partridgeberry Place in Ipswich, they were all less than 1 acre. They were more like a cottage. I bet their average lot size was 8,000 square feet. So yes, but that does require the off-lot shared well.
Yeah.
And then
That's okay.
quite a ways away from it, the off-lot shared community system. Or you can do individual septic systems in the common open space, or maybe individual wells. The shared system can be one for all the houses, or it can be just 3 houses are in this system, 3 houses are in that system, 3 houses are in a third system. There are all ways to configure it. But yes, you can definitely get below the 40,000 square foot lot size. Whether or not you want to increase the overall number of houses, Um, yes, you can do that too. So if you wanted to go from one, 2 houses, 2 acres per house as a density control, you could allow as an overlay district, perhaps in some places. And I suggest this as a kind of a starting mechanism. Not to do a cottage district town-wide, but you're probably focused on a cottage overlay district in certain parts of the town. Take it for a test drive for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. See what the first 1 or 2 cottage developments are like, and then you can go back and amend them and maybe allow them to be in more parts of the town once you've perfected this approach. But you could set a a minimum lot size of say 5,000 square feet for a house lot in a cottage district, and maybe a maximum lot size of 10,000 square feet. And let the developers have the flexibility to work within that range. Allow him to do some attached, whether it's semi-detached with one common, wall. It might be where 2 garages abut and the houses are on the ends and the garage is in the middle. Or it might be more like a standard duplex with a common wall between dwelling units. Again, he can have the flexibility, what he thinks the market wants. Developers are conservative and they'll take steps in a direction that they feel are going to sell. And they get more confidence, and then the next development they do, they might take it a step further in terms of maybe 3 or 4 houses in one building. But they would probably want to, and your cottage overlay may require architectural standards, so it's not just one big long box, but there are different roof heights and different elevations. Some are recessed, some are brought forward. The way that parking is handled is very critical, because when you get to a cottage development and a 50-foot lot, many developers are going to do the standard house with the 2-car garage attached to the front of the house. And only 1/3 of the house will be actually visible from the street. The other 2/3 are hidden behind garage doors. You can mitigate the non-traditional appearance of that by having a setback requirement that says, if you're going to have front-loaded garages on a house lot which is 50-foot wide, the garages are going to have a minimum setback of 30 feet. And the house is going to have a maximum setback, say, of 15 or 20 feet. So the house gets brought forward on the lot and is visually dominant, and the garages are pushed back and become visually recessive. So it doesn't look like you're driving down a street of garages. The other way of handling it is not typical for New England, but it's common around the rest of the country. And that is, you build a house facing the street and you build the garage behind the house facing a back lane, a common driveway behind it. Some people call them alleys, but that sounds urban and it sounds like where criminals lurk and dangerous places to hang around in. But an alley is a back lane, it's a common driveway, but it's behind the house. So as you drive down the street, and you can even have 40-foot or 35-foot frontages then, and get much more of a village compact feeling, then the garages are backing up to the houses and fronting onto an alley in the back. So there are a number of these design approaches which can make the compact development work really, really well, and avoid what I call snout houses, where the garages dominate. When I moved to Pennsylvania to take a job there in 1991, I had to buy a house where the garage was closer to the street than the house was. And I wasn't happy about it, but I loved the location and I loved its convenience to my job. But I have really tried ever since to help towns avoid development where the garages protrude and they are closer to the street than the house. Because when that model is replicated up and down the street, it's really very untraditional. Where I moved in Pennsylvania, I was the only house in the street with a garage closer than the house. And that was because it was an established neighborhood laid out in 1900 and there just happened to be a vacant lot. So that's a kind of a long-winded way of telling you how Bolton can have a nice compact village or cottage overlay and even get down to frontages that are 35 feet wide, not 50, and have
Well,
it look great.
So you said that that's really applies more to a cottage overlay and not necessarily
Yes.
the phosphid that we're sort of discussing, right?
Yes, because that was what one person asked in the memo comments. That
Okay.
how do you go forward with a cottage overlay when it was not well received the first time around?
But isn't, I mean, the objective is to preserve as much of the open space and the environment and the character, and at the same time, do it in a way that can attract developers to build the housing that this town needs and inevitably will be built. And it seems that a combination of a cottage overlay philosophy, grouping smaller houses together with thoughtful design, garage access, you know, don't call it an alley, call it a common drive that goes behind 4 houses or something like that. But uses the approach that is discussed in this 4-step process to get to the point of establishing where that neat little cottage overlay district is going to be, and then use the design criteria that was originally proposed the last time around with the town to be used in that. So it's a combination of a cottage overlay in terms of density and approach, and the big picture in terms of preservation of land using the 4-step process, which is basically a thoughtful approach to a phosphid.
I mean, that's great, but we don't have the cottage overlay now, right? I mean,
No.
we would need to get that passed first, and we couldn't get it passed last time. And now if you're saying we'll put even more restrictions on how it can be, maybe it's even harder to do it then.
Well, I think you can sell it. And I think, being somebody sitting there at town meeting, listening to this, if there had been examples, if there had been forums, showing what the outcome would be like, I think it would have worked a whole lot better. I think people looked at it and said, oh my, I can imagine what this is going to look like, as opposed to, hey, here are 10 examples of what actually has happened. It's much more saleable.
Yeah, I agree. That's kind of what I was saying earlier. I mean, it was basically like a black box and everybody put the ugliest view in their mind to it. But what I was wondering is maybe there's the potential that we can fold parts of the cottage overlay into phosphid, like density bonuses and stuff. Maybe we look into it that way. So it's not a completely new so it's not a new like bylaw completely, but we can like amend phosphid potentially. Maybe we can address it that way, and we can incrementally make changes to phosphid over the years, as we see fit. I don't know if that's something that we can look into.
I think the only difference was the cottage was an overlay district and it only applied to certain parcels in town, whereas phosphid applies everywhere, right?
Yeah, this is true. That's true.
But I agree with and again, I kind of assume part of what Randall is doing for us here is to help us improve our phosphid bylaws in order to better achieve what we're looking to achieve.
Yep.
Maybe too focusing on current events, but do we have sufficient bylaws for the shared utilities, water and sewer? Do we think the cottage style would introduce some more needs for bylaws on that side?
We don't have any bylaws for shared utilities. I mean, we have shared driveways and common driveways, but any shared utility is a private, just like your private well, it would be private to those owners. But where it does become issues is like we're having issues with Century Mill of it, going underneath the road and stuff like that. So, but I don't think there's any bylaws regarding any of that.
But it all falls under,
Towns that have applied this open space bylaw stuff, have they ran into issues with that, or have they introduced bylaws concurrently for the utilities? Or is it all
well,
Right.
it's under the purview of the Board of Health, and they have agreed with shared systems, septic, wells, etc., not going to the extent of a public water supply, which is a whole very different business. I mean, that falls under DPA and DEP. It's, it's a much bigger system, but you can have multiple residences that run under a shared septic system.
that aren't public water supplies?
And the Board of Health is, pretty agreeable to that. I think we'd have to spend some time with them discussing how far that goes.
I
And
don't
septic-
remember what we called out in the cottage overlay bylaw for utilities, because I mean, some of those were so dense, they'd obviously have to have shared utilities.
Right.
But I don't know, I don't remember calling out specific rules in that. We'd have to look at it again.
I don't either. I'd have to go look at it. It's been too long, but I don't remember having. It was kind of open-ended to the developer, to make it work.
I think that's like they would just have to take care of it, was kind of what it came down to.
But I think short of having a public water supply or some sort of packaged sewage treatment facility, it's worth talking to the Board of Health about, gee, how far can we go with traditional approaches of shared systems?
And again, before we get too hung up on the cottage overlays, to come back to what Randall's document was. So, one of the things, Randall, you talked about was moving away from Fosprid, and how do you pronounce it? Fosked, the FOSCD. So can you talk a little bit about that? What the difference is in your mind?
It's mostly a semantic difference. What it does is it puts the word conservation into it. The Fosprid is a marriage of the open space and the planned residential development. And planned residential developments are, over the years, they've not been a very good vehicle for designing development. It put a lot of flexibility in the hands of developers and asked very little in return in terms of what we get back. It's more semantic than anything else. I call these conservation developments or conservation subdivisions, but you can keep the Fosprid terminology. There's not a problem with that.
Easier to say.
I think is more of an issue is how do we insulate ourselves from having any more conventional developments in the town of Bolton? And you could do that by discouraging the conventional by saying, okay, you've got to have granite curbing or some type of curbing and 24 feet of pavement, right? But for the preferred alternative, Fosprid, we will allow you to do 20 feet of paving and no curbs. Don't need curbs at a 2-acre density. Really don't need curbing. And it's something that the town will inherit and will have to maintain. The 20-foot pavement is probably as much, if not a couple of feet more, than many, many town roads in Bolton that carry thousands of cars a day. And we're in a little Fosford that carries, 50 cars a day, 100 cars a day, 150 cars a day max. So you could really get down to 18 feet, honestly, and then have 3 feet of sand and gravel shoulders on each side, which would be covered with a little bit of loam and maybe some white clover seed, because clover's pretty trample resistant. And then you can have much more like a rural lane going through your phosphids rather than 24 feet of asphalt with curbing, which is very suburban and tending toward urban. So it gives the developer an economic incentive. Gee, I don't have to do 24 feet. I can do 18 of the paving, and I don't have to do the curbing at all because we'll just do swales.
But Randall, again, it's like no developers have been choosing the standard subdivision in recent
haven't?
years. So no, none. So I guess I'm curious. I don't know if anyone knows why that is. If it's just that the phosphid gives them, I mean, I suppose it saves them on seeding lawns, and that maybe gives them more flexibility in the lot layout. But
Yeah.
I mean, so I take your point about incentivizing people to go with the phosphid, but they're already doing it. So
Okay.
then the question is, I mean, maybe it's not, what's our, is it 33%? Is that what our open space requirement is right now?
Yeah, and that's underachieving.
Yeah,
It's
and so maybe
32% across the board. And I'm
Yeah.
suggesting more like doubling that. Because in Pennsylvania, when we imposed, not imposed, but towns regulated it according to my model, 50% of the buildable land is open space. The average open space, including the wetlands and floodplains, was then 62%. That's nearly double your 30, what is it, 35% you've got required?
So it's 33, and we had this
33.
discussion. We had this discussion with a developer maybe a year or two ago about whether the wetlands could be included in that. And I thought our answer was no, it can't be. So the 66% number you're stating, that includes wetlands in it? Is that?
It was 50% of the buildable.
Yeah.
Plus all the unbuildable, and that came out to an average over the last couple of decades, an average in all these townships in Pennsylvania, 62% open space.
Now, if it was 50% of the buildable spaces, I would be very interested to know how that would have impacted some previous subdivisions, and if they would have just gone with a traditional subdivision rather than phosphor in that case.
Well,
I don't.
I know you can't answer that, but I'm just saying.
If you increase your percentage from 33 to 50, you might see a shift of developers going back to the conventional, unless you said, okay, the 24-foot roads and the curbing, you can forget that if you do phosphid.
Yeah.
Because we don't need that. You're coming home from work, you're maybe coming down 495, you're filtering into some state roads, you're going into some town roads, and they're all wider than 18 feet, right? So why are you going into a 24-foot wide subdivision street that serves only a dozen houses? You don't need the 24 feet. It's more for the town of Bolton to maintain. It's 50% more asphalt for Bolton to put in that subdivision every time it repaves the road, as opposed to an 18-foot. So I'm a conservative. My mother was Scottish. You don't have to spend the money, don't spend it.
I think and I don't know the history of it, but when I think that 24-foot number came about, they didn't require sidewalks. And so like I have, streets near me that are relatively newer subdivisions, but like still from 20 plus years ago, probably. And they have wide roads, but no sidewalks. And I think now we require sidewalks in the, when we do subdivisions. So that yeah, maybe we could look at changing that number. And
Okay,
but to be
if-
honest, we have waived that 24-foot number with several subdivisions.
Well, what I'd suggest is you don't waive it if he comes in with a conventional.
Yeah.
If elevating the open space from 32 to 50 pushes some developers back to conventional, you can head that off by having some disincentives. You can also say to developers, we're going to simplify the process. It's going to be just a straight by right for Fosbrid. And you're going to have to jump through more hoops on the special permit. And special permits are highly discretionary. So developers generally tend not to want to do a special permit if they've got a by right alternative. And someone, it may have been Pamela, said, well, if you do this, the by right, don't you give up some of your development review capability? And the answer is no. If you require 18 things that the developer must do, he has to cross his T's and dot his I's on every 18 items. So that in a by right development, the developer doesn't get any free ride, but what he does get is a guarantee that if he fulfills all 18 requirements, he has to be approved. And the developers like that. They don't like to go into a special permit situation where they can be denied for a whole host of reasons, that because planning boards have a tremendous amount of discretion with special permits, and it makes developers edgy.
Well, that certainly was the argument in Harvard from the developers when that whole thing was discussed. But I think going back, what are our objectives? They're clearly, we want to maintain as much open space as possible. We want to maintain the right open space, which I think gets back to the, the four-step process, at least looking up front. And at the same time, we want to give developers an incentive and meet our housing needs. And the only way to do that is to allow increased density with design guidelines. And that's why I connected the village overlay. I mean, that's part of it. How do we gain our objectives and accommodate developers' objectives and our housing objectives all at the same time? And I see that as the only way to do it.
I would agree that the town is on the right track of offering a density bonus. If you're going from one house for 2 acres to 4 houses to the acre, that's an 800% increase. Don't know that you need to go that far. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I don't think you necessarily need to go that far, but you could. As I said, if you have a parcel and 50% is open space, and you're trying to get 4 units to the acre overall, then you get 8 units to the acre within the development area, which means you're down to about a 5,000 square foot lot, or some attached housing, some duplexes, some 3 families. You can accomplish all of that if you want to go to as an 800% increase in your density.
Well, maybe not that far, but I think we've also got to think about different types of housing. I mean, you talked about duplexes and things like that, and people are looking for that. And if they're designed properly, and we have good design guidelines, not necessarily special permit, then to me, that makes perfect sense, as long as what we get out of it is preservation of open space. So we get more housing, more appealing housing, more affordable housing, and more open space. It's a big goal, but we've at least in the past done some thinking in the context of the village overlay. And it need not be specifically the village overlay, stuffed into a more conservative approach to the phosphid. But I think there's a combination of the two that could be worked out so that and again, maybe on a trial basis. But frankly, we don't have a hell of a lot more land to try it out on. So we kind of need to get going.
Well, and that, I guess that was another point, right, to that. I mean, so the phosphid right now applies to, or even the subdivision applies to 10 acres. All right, can someone verify? I think it's 10 acres is a minimum parcel size for a subdivision. Eric might know.
I don't think there's a minimum for subdivision.
I thought phosphid was 10.
I don't remember. I think that's what we did for cottage overlay, but
oh, maybe you're right.
Yeah, I thought it was cottage overlay that was limited.
Okay.
yeah, I don't think it is. I think basically you're a subdivision if you're over 5 units, because shared is 1 or 2, common driveway is 3, 4, or 5, but anything over 5, once you're 6, you're a subdivision.
You're a subdivision. Okay.
But yeah, I think what would be very useful, and we'll do it, is to do what was done at Harvard. And that is basically having what amounts to a charrette, where you take a piece of land and understand the best way to get high density and save open space with multiple types of housing at the same time. And I think when you start looking at how that works out, you look at your objective, look at how you got to the objective, and then start thinking about how you would codify that process, whether it's being an overlay combined with an enhanced phosphid or whatever. But a type of housing, I think, is a critical part of this.
Can I ask a quick question? In our current phosphid rules and regs, do we have anything specific to requiring site visits by engineers when establishing the amount of buildable lots, I guess, to use for the phosphid?
The answer is no. I mean, in terms of sites, some do, some don't. But they generally look at.
We kind of rely on, we've relied on the developer, really.
And they typically look at, the wetlands and other things in their layout, and then figure out how to make the phosphid work from that.
Okay, and do they do any testing of the soil? I guess, like Randall had mentioned, maybe there was this yield approach.
We do
the
some
extent of
testing.
subsewage disposal.
And that's one of the first things that they do, right? They have they have a lot. They have to go and do some sort of before they even think about designing anything, building. They have to make sure that the soil perks in enough spots.
I don't know that it's defined specifically how many they have to do or what they have to do, but I don't remember if that's written down. But I know that they do it.
Well, I mean, they have to for Board of Health regulations on subsurface disposal. I mean, they have to do 4 depots, 2 perk tests, all of that, and find locations. And that's basically how the house locations are determined, frankly, at this point.
Got it.
And
Okay.
wells are generally only by the distance regulations with respect to the lot lines and the septic system and the residence.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things early on that Randall mentioned, where the site visits that kind of intrigued me. I think, at least for board members, that would provide a lot of, intel about how to make some intelligent decisions about each development that comes up.
And I think, I guess the thing that strikes me interesting about the 4-step, somewhat inverted process is that before we come in with any kind of even preliminary plan, to have that site visit and understand pretty thoroughly with multiple overlays, wetlands, some reasonable idea of soil, slopes, that sort of thing, what the place looks like. Perish the thought, get a landscape architect involved. early in the game. I think that's one of the big challenges right now, that a lot of houses are located by Board of Health regulations, phosphid guidelines, and frankly, that's pretty much it.
I will say on the, so we permitted a subdivision on South Bolton Road maybe last
Yeah,
year.
we walked that, and that was, I think that was a good example of
Yeah.
what we ought to do.
Yeah, that was,
But
Martha's,
Yeah, that one. That one there, the traditional subdivision versus the Fosbrid was basically the same. I mean, you had to stare at the two plans to actually see a difference in them. And I'm not, that has nothing to do with anything. I'm just saying, like, for, you know, at the end of the day, they went with the Fosbrid, they went with the special permit on that one when it didn't dramatically change very much on the between doing this a regular subdivision. So so we've been going about an hour and 15 here. So what are kind of the next steps in the process, Randall?
Well, I think the scope of work called for an analysis of your codes with recommendations. And the second piece was to provide a workshop with a lot of graphic images illustrating what these look like in the process. And that's particularly important for the general public that has never served on the planning board. I think that probably between those two steps, it might be very helpful to insert an intermediate step. And that is to provide potential bylaw language that would be specifically added to your subdivision regulations or your zoning bylaw. I didn't really anticipate that when I put together the scope. But I think that would, you know, having had this discussion with you tonight, makes it sort of clear to me that that would be a very helpful way to bridge where we are today with the review memo and having something that's more detailed and sort of ready to insert into your bylaws before we get to the public presentation, which would happen later in the spring. So I might propose a revised scope to insert that step to provide you with bylaw language and subdivision control language so that you could look at that and we could get together with another Zoom to discuss that in detail. And these things I think would snap into focus for everybody. So I think that might be our next step, is to do that between now and say mid-March. And I could turn that around fairly soon. I think probably by the end of the month, and we could meet, you know, via Zoom in early or mid-February. I'm going to be gone from March 12th to April 5th. I'm just disappearing with my wife. You're going to waste some money and float around the Mediterranean, get away from those long Maine winters. Your winters in Bolton are not as dramatic as ours here. I know because I used to live in Eastern Massachusetts. So I'll just put together a little amended scope with that intermediate step for you to look at, and then I can, if the answer is yes, go ahead. We'll proceed down that path, because I think that's sort of the missing link between the two elements of the scope as we now have it.
Yeah, I think
understanding where you
sorry,
are.
we're ultimately looking for, you know, something actionable out of this. So I think that sounds like a good idea.
Would it not be a good idea also to get our heads around what our objectives are? you know, we want to save open space. And what we've got, we have phosphorus, we have, you know, at least draft language that we've presented to the town on the cottage overlay. You know, how do we think all of this would fit together? We'd like to have save open space. We'd like to accommodate more density in housing. Maybe in terms of overall subdivision size. We need to look at the realistic limitations of doing that with the Board of Health and what the implications are in terms of our limitations on housing type. You know, should we recommend, perish the thought, that we have multifamily housing and things like that in order to get the density up and save open space? I think summarizing our objectives and then looking at what we've got and what we could have with the cottage overlay, and then with that in mind, look at what Randall would propose in terms of changing the bylaw or the subdivision regs.
Yeah, I mean, so I agree with that. And Randall, hopefully, I think you've gotten a taste of sort of what, you know, we all, like Bob said, I mean, you know, we kind of want to have more diverse housing, more dense housing, preserve open space. I mean, those, we can certainly go into more detail about what we're looking for, but those are, I think that's what we as a board have always talked about. That was really what the cottage overlay was all about.
If I could
Take an
get a
eating
copy,
too.
if someone could send me a Word document copy of the cottage overlay, that would help me, because I might be able to make some recommendations on that specific part, as well as the phosphate.
Yeah, we can get you a copy of that.
Yeah.
Has there been talk of dividing or creating additional residential zones? We only have one zone that requires 2 acres, and maybe just applying these cluster subdivisions uniformly throughout town isn't
Yeah,
the best option. I don't know how well received that is. But typically there's more than one residential zoning requirement in communities where you
think
concentrate your densities.
I think that's what we were trying to get with the overlay.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, maybe a residential 1, residential 2 is something. Even like Main Street, you know, that'd be different in itself as well.
Well, it's de facto different as it stands.
I worked on a open space residential design bylaw in Holden. It was pretty successful, and we required 50% of the open space be preserved, and you had to exclude wetlands and 15% slopes from your calculations. But we also offered density bonuses for affordable housing provisions and allowed specific different housing types in the development based on the underlying zoning district. It was easier because there's public water and sewer in a lot of the locations. So that's really something that makes our density a little difficult.
Well,
I mean,
but it's doable. I think it would be very useful to see that, because that sounds very much like what we've been talking about, with the exception of public water and sewer.
At some point, I mean, my lot is an acre. My house is from 1970, I think. So I mean, at some point they did have smaller parcels in town. I don't know when they went to the 2-acre model, and if they did that specifically because they were having a harder time, you know, with wells and septic, having enough space for those.
That was the rationale, but not necessarily the reason.
Well, I mean, but I don't know. You know, I don't know when that changed or who changed it.
Sometimes the response from the public to increase in development is to increase the lot size, thinking it'll result in less housing overall in the community, which we have found is not usually the case. It just results in additional sprawl, but
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened. And one of the outcomes was when, back in the 70s, when they did the 208 water quality studies, Bolton was the only town that came out clean, quote, because of your great zoning. So we've leaned on that ever since.
It's often also a function of people not wanting more traffic, more kids to educate in school. So if you go from 1 acre zoning to 2 acre zoning, you really do cut in half the number of houses that it could eventually be built. But as you've said, it led to more sprawl because land is being used much less efficiently.
Yep.
This may be out of scope, but Bob, have you talked to Randall about the Meadow Road incident and how we
Yeah, I
had,
have.
like, you know, like A&Rs, like side by side A&Rs, multiple of them that kind of that weren't overall planned as. I mean, is there any way that we can group those up into some type of planned development, or is there just no way legally to do that?
Those are, Randall, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the A&R process in Massachusetts. It's pretty unique to our state.
Very generous. Maybe 65 years ago, a long time ago, when they contributed model language to the Great and General Court to help the Great and General Court decide how to write their zoning enabling legislation. So the home builders were big players back then, and Massachusetts ended up being, I think, the only state in the country that defines a subdivision as a development of land requiring a new street. In every other state, if you create 3 or more house lots, whether they're on a public street or a new street, it's a subdivision. And this has been a vexing problem for a half a century. How towns have been really forced to accept strip development along every single existing roadway with virtually no control except lot size and setback. An attorney named Mark Bobrowski 30 years ago thought he had the answer, and he called it a major residential development. And he defined that under the zoning enabling legislation rather than the subdivision statute. And I might have misspoken because of the developers that came in and worked on the subdivision enabling legislation. And they said subdivision is only when you build a new street, unique to the United States, Massachusetts approach. Mark Bobrowski came up with this idea, let's have the zoning, not the subdivision regulation, state, enabling legislation control. So under zoning, he said, let's have a major residential development, an MRD. If you create more than 3 lots in a 5-year period, you have to be regulated as if you were a subdivision. A few towns adopted it. I think that it was challenged in court and ultimately was overruled by the courts. I don't know that anyone in Massachusetts has got a good way to enable towns to control strip development along existing roads because of the A&R legislation being so clear at the state level. And it's a shame, but I don't have if I had a magic wand, or if you were on the state line, you could say, I'd like to join Connecticut or Massachusetts or Rhode Island. Not on the state line.
That's interesting. I didn't realize it was just Massachusetts.
Oh yeah. Of course, people live in Massachusetts, assume that, that's the way it is. But I assure you, I've worked in Rhode Island and Connecticut and Maine and Pennsylvania and advised counties around the country, counties where they do the zoning. And yes, Massachusetts is unique in having A&Rs. I'm sorry. I wish I could help you with that. I will reach out to our land use planner and attorney that I know who lives in Northampton. Haven't spoken with him in quite a while, Joel Russell, and ask Joel if he knows of any way that you can gain more control over the A&R beast.
Well, we have the poster child if you need an example.
So
Okay.
that's in one of my notes to contact Joel about A&Rs.
Great, thank you. Anything else that anyone wanted to cover tonight while we've got Randall here?
This was good. Did everybody look at the examples that Pam sent around? No, I think that's as illustrative as anything really before you get into the specific language. But I do think it would be a good idea if we put together what our goals are to put our arms around that and consider how one would do that and get that to Randall pretty quickly.
Yeah.
We've discussed it here, but I think it would be nice to
Yeah, we'll have it on paper and we can
pull it together. Yeah.
send it around for people to review.
Yep.
Okay.
If I have a few more case studies, I'll send them to Pam to circulate. The case studies, I think, are a great way to see how other communities have dealt with phosphorates and cottage overlays.
You know what I think my most recent experience with all of this was the town common, and the way that the town common was laid out was with two charrettes with landscape architects involved in both of the charrettes, and it was fascinating to see, looking at what the layout and environment was, topos in great detail, wetlands and all the rest of it, and then start figuring out how the goals and objectives for a town common fits into the land that's available. And it was very similar to what I ultimately saw in Harvard with the examples that Randall gave.
Where was that town common development, Rob? And
It's in the middle of Bolton, right smack.
it's in Bolton, and how many units?
It's not a unit, it became a town common.
It's open space.
Oh, it's open space. It was
Yeah.
a charrette to plan the open space.
Yep.
Well, when you mentioned the word charrette, it reminded me that I've worked with a town of about 8 or 10,000 in North Carolina near Charlotte named Davidson. It's where Davidson College is located. And they require a mini charrette for every single subdivision.
Yeah, that's
And it works really well because you get people working together around a table. It's a public meeting. There are a lot of ideas that come out. And if you'd like to consider that, I'll get some wording out of Davidson's ordinances. Because it produces really great results.
yeah, well, it certainly did with the town common. We went in with what we thought was the concept we wanted, and it was all done privately. And when we came out of those charrettes, it was a very different design.
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of charrettes, because it enables you to really look at something through a number of perspectives and come up with an idea which is better than any one individual could come up with. My best subdivisions are charrettes. I did one in Willington, Connecticut, and I may have described it to you, I'm not sure, but we went out on a frosty morning in March and walked to this property for an hour and a half. The Conservation Commission and every member of the planning board, the developer, his engineer. We went back to the town offices. We had a pizza lunch and talked about what we saw and the notes we took. And then I rolled out the tracing paper, put it on top of the existing resources site analysis map, showed where the stone walls were, the streams, the topo, etc. And I said, our goal is how many house lots here? And they said, 150. And 2 hours later, we had a 150 lot layout built around 50% open space plus unbuildable land. And the developer said, in 4 hours, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, we accomplished more than I could have accomplished in 3 months. It was a charrette. We didn't call it that. We just got together and sat down. It was an open public meeting. No decisions were taken. No votes were taken. It was a public workshop, but the developer went away. His engineer took my plan. He came back and hardlined it with a CAD drawing and got his approval pretty quickly.
And that's exactly what
Planning
we
board
did.
didn't have to go through it again and again and again because it was all done.
But
So-
we had 2 charrettes. In between, we laid out what the concepts were in the town library. And I think I had 1,700 individual comments and suggestions. And then we
Wow.
pulled it back together. Oh, it was a very big deal. And then we consolidated everything and came out with one recommendation. But it was all done, real time with tracing paper on top of plot plans and topos, and all sorts of things.
Now, was that for the town common or was that another project?
No, that was for the town common.
Yeah. Well, what I did in Wellington was a condensed version of that, and I'm glad I didn't have to sort through 1,700 comments.
Well, I assure you that half of them were redundant, but that's okay.
Yeah, still had to look at them.
Okay, so we've gone on for a while here, so let's we'll wrap this up for tonight. Randall, we will get you a list of or kind of like submission statements from the town that can help guide you with what some of those bylaw recommendations could be. And we'll try to get that to you as soon as we can.
And then we'll get the language for the cottage overlay district.
Yep.
So,
Yeah. But
Good.
we appreciate you coming to meet with us tonight. Very interesting, very helpful. And look forward to keeping it going.
Yeah, I wish I'd had a slideshow idea to begin with, because I could have run through, 20 minutes of slides that would have made explanations a lot more clear. But that's what we'll certainly do when we get to the public stage, maybe sometime in late April or May.
Definitely.
I know we have a deadline of sometime in June.
but
Correct
yeah, I
this
think
up.
this is good that I think you'll be informed by this conversation for that conversation.
Great. Well, thank you all
Okay.
for the time.
Thank you, Randall.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Randall.
Have a good night.
Good night now.
Night.
So Pam, we have we do have a meeting scheduled next week. Was there anything on that agenda or?
I only have one A&R.
Okay. So we should keep that on, I guess. I'm looking at February. So our February schedule is the 14th and the 28th. Are they in a rush on that A&R?
I did ask if they were in a rush. We'd go beyond the 21. It was submitted on the 11th.
Okay, yeah. So
Oh, I'm sorry. Today, yeah, the 11th. That's right.
okay.
7/14. So the 21 days would be up on the 1st.
Okay, so we'll keep our meeting for next week, and should just be a short one, hopefully.
Could we try to prioritize the list of goals that Pam has put together?
That running list that we had,
Right.
we can certainly talk about that. I mean, none of those are going to be.
No. It's not going to happen for this town meeting, but
Yeah,
but some of it may very well be just subdivision stuff that could be handled with hearings.
yeah, we can certainly put that on the agenda and talk about it.
Can the cottage overlay also be sent around to to new members as well.
Good point. Yep.
Yeah.
Can you give me any idea how long ago that was? Do you recall? Was it before
Like-
COVID, after COVID?
Oh,
Yeah,
before.
definitely before,
Before,
five or 6 years ago or
Yeah.
so.
Okay,
when I
Alright.
first started.
I could probably find it too, but I bet you have the most recent somewhere.
I'm sure it's on the computer.
Well,
Yeah.
Pam will know.
Yeah.
Pam Powell in this case, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
The other Pam.
Right.
Okay, anything else that people wanted to talk about tonight?
Yeah, I got a quick question, Mike.
Sure, go ahead. Jim.
With that information that we got on the Google Drives for the CME project there, are we gonna have any discussion? Like, I was going through some of the specs and going through some of the prints that were on there and everything, and I had a couple of questions here and there. Are we gonna be discussing that at any when's the best forum to discuss this? On just some of the questions that might have come up, because this is the first time I think I've seen any of those the plans, especially with the water and everything.
So if you mean the DEP,
Yes.
those, yeah, I mean, I don't know that we really need to discuss those. I mean, so that's between, state of Massachusetts and that subdivision. Like
Right.
This board has no authority over that water system or any of that stuff. The only thing that really came out of that I think is of note to us is the capitalization of the water system. That if they don't have that capitalized, and I'm trying to figure out where this would be. Like if we had written language into the original subdivision approval about how they need to capitalize that water system.
Yeah.
Just because if something breaks, how do they pay for repairing the street for something that went wrong? So I don't know where that would be spelled out, but I think we would certainly want some money held in bond or reserve for the water system. But I mean, it sounds like that's required from the state anyway, so they just need to do that.
Okay.
But yeah, that's not necessarily us enforcing, or that's not us enforcing that at all.
And yeah, well, I mean, it was like some of the questions that might have been brought up on other meetings or what have you. I mean, like that whole tape thing and everything else like that. I just wasn't sure if if it was in the specs then. What is it? Is it a code that they're looking for with the DPW, the head of the DPW? I really don't want to get into it tonight, but I was just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, send me any questions you have, Jim.
All right, perfect. That's all I need. Okay.
We'll do it that way. Okay.
All right. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Anything else?
There were a detailed set of design plans for the water main that DEP sent that were in that folder that we didn't have as part of our file. So hopefully that will be helpful for the
Very-
residents as we move forward. Yeah.
Were
Very helpful.
those as-built?
They
Yeah.
weren't as built. They were the definitive subdivision that was approved by the town just had a water line on the plans which said to be designed in the future, I think, something of that map, something like that. But DEP sent us the definitive water design plans. So all the engineering plans with the details and the materials and depth were all sent to us by DEP.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. That was good to get.
It shows us where the gate valves and things are supposed to be, which we didn't have.
Right.
Yeah. But we still need an as-built to say that that's where.
Yeah, and we can't
Things actually
locate,
are.
part of the problem is those gate valves on the plans we can't find in the field, so.
Really?
Yeah,
That's some of the questions.
Wow. I didn't realize that. Got
We
a
suspect
water
they
main
paved
break, got an
over
excavator.
some of it. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't want to get into it tonight. I was just wanting the best course of action. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. Okay, if there is nothing else to discuss, I will make a motion to adjourn.
Seconded.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
I
Okay. All right. Have a good night, everyone. We'll talk
All right,
later.
thank you.
have a good night.
Thank
Bye.
you.